Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Hillary McBride. Hillary is a clinical psychologist in Canada, and she has a new book out entitled Holy Hurt: Understanding Spiritual Trauma and the Process of Healing, which I have found to be an immensely helpful book, which I highly recommend if you think it might be of help to you. I think one of the reasons that this sort of work is so compelling to me and important to me is that many years ago when my wife and I were young marrieds and I was a young graduate student in theology working on my PhD, we had an extended family member who was headed into rehab. And Laura and I knew nothing those days of the dynamics of addiction or family dynamics or codependency. So a therapist who knew a lot about addiction offered to sit with us and just kind of give us a crash course on these matters. And she knew that I was a graduate student in theology. And so at the end of the session, she looked me in the eye and she said, "Now I have something to say to you." And she said, "Bad theology messes up people's lives." And I've carried that with me closely through all these decades, trying to remember that often in my work. At a minimum, first, do no harm, and then seek to point people in the direction of a theology that is life-giving, that's true and good and beautiful. But first, do no harm. I know, unfortunately, that I have not always kept that first rule of first doing no harm, but nonetheless, I've sought to remember that wisdom that I was given and to point to some life-giving alternative. So again, I find this interview with Hillary just really compelling and a really helpful book. I hope you find it helpful as well.
Hey friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I've been delighted to hear from so many of you about positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter.
Every Christmas, I think about the gifts that really matter. Not the wrapped ones under the tree, but the ones that change someone's life forever. And recently, I heard a story from Mercy Ships that I just can't shake. A mom brought her little boy on board. He'd been living with a condition that could be fixed with a simple surgery, but there was no surgeon anywhere near his village. After his free operation, she said, "You've given my son his future back." Y'all, that is a Christmas gift. Globally, 5 billion people lack access to surgical care. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's only one surgeon for every 200,000 people. But Mercy Ships is stepping into that gap in the most beautiful way, bringing free, life-transforming surgeries to people who would otherwise have no access to care. They help the blind see. They straighten twisted limbs. They remove deadly tumors. They treat cleft conditions and so much more. With state-of-the-art hospital ships, they provide safe surgery for children and adults completely free of charge. And it's all powered by an all-volunteer crew of surgeons, nurses, engineers, cooks, people who give their time and talents to make the world better. And here's where we get to help. Your donation provides free, safe surgeries to people in desperate need of hope. This Christmas, you can make your impact felt, and every gift is matched. Please donate today at mercyships.org/podcast. That's mercyships.org/podcast. You know how every year there's that one holiday moment that becomes a family favorite, like showing up to a Christmas dinner and bringing a dish that turns out to be the hit of the night? That's what could happen if you bring Omaha steaks, you guys, because nothing says I love you and also please invite me back next year like showing up with the world's best steaks. From holiday hosting to those unforgettable gifts, Omaha Steaks delivers the world's best steak experience. You can gift family and friends USDA certified tender steaks, juicy burgers, cozy comfort meals, and so much more. And right now, during their Sizzle All the Way sale, you can get 50% off site-wide at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our friends get an extra $35 off with the promo code FUN at checkout. There's nothing like receiving a gift of Omaha Steaks. Everything shows up perfectly packed, super convenient, and the flavor, exceptional. Their filet mignons are unreal, USDA certified, very tender, and every order is backed by their 100% guarantee. They've been America's original butcher since 1917, a family-owned company with over 100 years of expertise, and you taste that care in every bite. It's not just steaks, burgers, chicken, pork, seafood, dessert. They've got everything. So save big on gourmet gifts and more holiday favorites with Omaha Steaks. Visit omahasteaks.com for 50% off site-wide during their Sizzle All the Way sale. And for an extra $35 off, just use the promo code FUN at checkout. Terms apply. See site for details. That's omahasteaks.com, and the code is FUN.
Hillary McBride is a clinical psychologist, researcher, speaker, and author whose work centers at the intersection of spirituality, trauma, embodiment, and mental health. She hosts the Holy Hurt podcast on spiritual trauma, and today we're discussing her book, Holy Hurt, Understanding Spiritual Trauma and the Process of Healing. Welcome, Hillary.
Thank you for having me.
Delighted to have you with us and looking forward to the conversation. Grateful to have you with us. I wonder if we could start with your working definition of trauma, and then a working definition of spiritual trauma.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yes. I would say my working definition of trauma is a borrowed one. So it's one that we often use in the trauma community of too much, too fast, too soon, mixed with not enough of the right stuff that we need in order to be connected, to feel safe, to manage what life throws at us. So it's both the really big things that overwhelm us, that are scary and terrifying and awful, the commissions, and then the absence of what we needed, what was important for us, the good things we didn't get, as Gabor Mate said, so the omissions. And usually what that means is there's a kind of shattering, or we get overwhelmed. There's something too much about what happens, even the absence, that overwhelms our capacity to cope.
So a trauma is not necessarily any given experience or kind of experience, as it is some experience or omission, as you said. But in this case, an experience in which there's a lack of something else in order to process that. Is that one way to think about it?
Mostly. And there's even like another kind of way of looking at it, which is trauma is what happens inside of us because of what happened to us. So it's less about the events and more about which events occurred that created this kind of reaction inside of us.
Yeah.
So it's like this mix. I mean, philosopher Michelle Panchuk says that the word trauma is multiply ambiguous because it means all the different things. And we're like, what is it mean?
Yeah.
But something about something that happened or didn't happen, and then nervous system response on the other side of it.
So then spiritual trauma, how would you define that?
Oh, yes. Well, if we think about trauma, like one of the words I didn't use, but there's the word trauma originally means wound, that there is something that we could even say is like a kind of shattering of sorts to the psyche, to the soul, to the sense of what it means to be human in the world. And so if we're looking at spiritual trauma, it's a way of saying that there's something that's happened in our lives that has fractured something, that has overwhelmed us in terms of our inability to cope, and has changed the way that we orient to the world. There's an injury or a wound of a significant nature to our spiritual self. Sometimes that comes through overtly religious or spiritual contexts, like when there's a religious leader or figure or behavior or doctrine or place. And other times, because of what has already been embedded inside of us, related to worldview and our assumptions about who God is and where God is and why bad things or good things happen, it may be that a trauma feels like a spiritual trauma. A trauma of any kind feels like it's spiritual trauma because of the meaning-making framework that we've been given. So maybe it's a kind of trauma that has an impact on our religious or spiritual beliefs and ruptures them in some way.
Now, in this particular book, you state clearly at the beginning that you're going to avoid the use of any so-called religious language. And why did you think that's important in a book that's and I can note to readers that it's published by one of the well-known Christian publishing houses, and yet you're explicitly choosing not to use that kind of language. So talk us through that sort of decision.
Yeah, so I'm a trauma specialist, and one of the things that is important to me in the work that I do is to privilege the survivor and privilege the vulnerability of the survivor and the place where the wound is. In particular, in religious and Christian contexts, when scripture or Christian language or religious language has been weaponized and used as a means of enacting trauma, I think it would be really hard for those readers to read a text and have me use some of the same passages or language that was part of the injury that they sustained, the abuse, the trauma. So as a way of almost being a-theological or a-religious, my privileging of the psychological, of the nervous system, of the theoretical, of the survivor is a way of saying, I'm not going to do to you what was done to you, even if well-meaning. I'm going to avoid some of those things that might feel too complicated or painful for you to read through to stay with the point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah, this was very interesting to me because, my academic disciplines is theology, and yet I discovered, I'm talking 20 years ago or so, when I was going through a pretty difficult time in my own life. And I went through a season where I was working with therapy and I was doing some recovery work and so forth. And I was fascinated to realize how I often was triggered by anyone that had anything to say theologically. And it was just like, I do not want to hear it. I do not want to hear it. And it doesn't help me at all. And I need some other vocabulary, at least for this season of my life. To process what's happening to me. So I appreciated the way that you did that in the book myself.
We've been told that spirituality is transpersonal and it extends beyond space and religious language, or maybe even through our theological doctrine, we've been told God is everywhere and God is all places and all knowing, that there's really no place that we can go to escape that then. And it's kind of like the scene of the crime, if you will. Like, let's just say there was an assault on somebody and it happened in a back alleyway. I'm not going to say, hey, let's go talk about your assault in the back alleyway. Let's go, do you want to go hang out and meet up for tea and talk about how life is in the back alleyway? Our nervous systems are really good at coding and storing and integrating cues that are connected to what has felt dangerous for us. That's actually a very important function of our survival as a species. And so to be able to promise people, I'm not going to take you into the back alley. We're going to sit at home in the comfort of your home with your coziest things, and we're going to talk about why it's hard to go into the back alley. We're going to talk about why your body feels scared because of what happened in the back alley, but I'm not going to do to you what happened there, and I'm not going to make you go there and assume that it feels safe and easy and that you can even listen to what I'm saying if we're standing in the place where your body got traumatized.
Yeah. So if you will indulge me on one theological matter here just a moment.
Sure.
So you say early in the book, use the metaphor of the body and a house. And you say, if my body is a house, then spiritual trauma means that my house is haunted and that God is the ghost. And when I read that, I think I hear what she's getting at, but I wonder if we could amend that sentence very slightly by putting scare quotes around the word God.
Sure.
Just to say that, but I don't know. How do you react to what I just suggested there?
Well, the first thing is it's actually not my words. Those are the words of J.S. Park.
Oh, okay.
So I can't actually
sorry,
contend with them.
Yeah.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
J.S. Park is, he's using that as a way to call on the kind of supernatural Eastern interpretation of what it's like to experience spiritual trauma, particularly for those who live in Asian communities. So he would have way more to say about that than I would. But I think what I'm getting at, or what I'm hearing you get at, is maybe something about how we construct God, or something about who we perceive God to be may be in fact different than who God is, or maybe there's a way that God and the story about God has been part of the trauma and the weapon in a way that is more about people using God as opposed to who God is. Is that kind of where you're going with that?
Yes, thank you. So let's dig into that just a little bit.
Okay.
But first let me back up and ask, when you think about so-called spiritual trauma, what are some of the complexities entailed in what you mean by spiritual trauma that might not be in more generalized trauma?
Yeah, there are a few. One of them primarily is the social reinforcement about the normalization of the trauma. So although that's not always the case, like let's just say someone's experienced clergy abuse, like a clergy sexual abuse. It was a single incident. They told someone in the community defended them and protected them and said, we're getting this leader out of here and they need treatment and this is not okay and they're being reported. Then maybe that person has spiritual trauma. I wouldn't be surprised, but they might also have a sense embedded in the memory of my spiritual community protected me and defended me. So that could be a scenario. More often than not, what happens in spiritually traumatizing and religiously abusive communities is that the normalization of the systemic thought and behavior and social context is so reinforced that everybody has the story inside of them, like, this is good, this is how it should be. I'm bad, I'm evil. And in fact, the more that people believe these things about themselves, the more that they're praised, lauded, celebrated, seen as mature, put into positions of leadership. And so what's strange about this particular phenomena is that there is so many people around each person saying, it's good to believe you're bad. It's good. The thing that happened to you is right. Oh no, you shouldn't question that. Don't question that. That's sinful. So it kind of, one, it suppresses any other way of thinking about things, but it keeps people in positions of powerlessness to change or to know or to think differently about what's happened versus, maybe a context, like I said, where one bad thing happens and people go, that was wrong. That shouldn't have happened. And in that way, it's not dissimilar from an abusive family, where if someone grows up in an abusive family and it feels like this is just the way things are and this is who we are and this is what is reality, it can be really hard to see differently or to feel like we deserve anything else or that this becomes the norm.
Yeah.
But it's just a very strange thing in spiritually traumatic contexts for people to also be told, this is good, this is what God wants.
Yeah. When you think about symptoms, you're working with a patient, what kind of symptoms are going to indicate to you, okay, there may be something here, some sort of experience of spiritual trauma? What's going to tip you off that you pay attention to that?
Yeah. Well, one, experiences people describe of being in high control, high demand environments. So what they describe as being normal about the spiritual and social context that they grew up in. Another thing would be probably nervous system response. So are people chronically dissociated and have like no contact with any body sensation, no awareness of their body, really hard for them to feel emotion. Things like chronic and complex shame, a fundamental belief of their own badness and the rightness of mistrusting in themselves, and a sense of really not even knowing who they are or what they want. Things like spiritual bypassing, I would see, where...
Spiritual bypassing?
It's a term coined by John Wellwood in the 1980s. He was primarily talking about it in Buddhist contexts initially, and then kind of broaden the definition to look at it in other spiritual contexts. The idea is that people use spiritual practices or doctrine or behaviors to get away from uncomfortable feelings, that they get away from what's inside. So instead of feeling the sadness, I pray the prayer, I do the compulsion, I just dissociate. I say, it doesn't matter, I'm not attached. So there's lots of different ways that it could look, but it's a pretty good tip-off for me that this has been a very well-worn pattern in a person's past, when as soon as I ask them to feel something that's kind of uncomfortable, they move right away to a verse, a prayer, a practice, a statement. Well, to God be the glory. Oh, it's fine. Like, God uses all things for good, right? Some way of really trying to get away from and undermine the pain of the emotion.
Yeah. Are there other particular things about a communal context or power dynamics that especially cause you concern when you note them? Let's say you're looking at some given faith community. I would assume that you are especially attuned to power dynamics or the way relationships
Yes.
work. What are you going to be? What's going to get your attention in a way that causes you concern?
Yeah. So people are told that they can't trust themselves, and in particular, that they need to trust an outsourced moral authority. So those dynamics together create this really, really problematic phenomena where if people are being told by trusted leaders, your heart will lead you astray, your heart is deceitful, you can't trust it, trust me instead, then it outsources power to people and it makes it really hard to question authority or hold authority into accountability. So those two dynamics together, I think, are important. A colleague of mine, Dr. Preston Hill, will talk about spiritual gaslighting as well. So spiritual authorities saying to congregants or participants in the community, like, well, you can't trust yourself, and you're dangerous, and you can't really trust what's going on inside. And like, oh no, God didn't say that. I'll tell you what God said. So if we're making people question their own lived experience and their own experience of their spirituality, and using a position of authority or power to grab power away from people.
Yeah. So, I can imagine somebody listening and wondering this. So on the one hand, it seems obvious that sort of dynamic that you described, the spiritual outsourcing to a moral authority, and then that the leader says, "I'm going to be that authority," right? You can't trust yourself, but you can trust me. That obviously is a mechanism that so quickly can become abusive or overstep its bounds. And yet at the same time, I mean, it does seem true, right, that it's a expected human experience that at various times in our lives we can trust our own intuitions better as we grow in the formation of our intuitions or of our moral sensibilities or our capacities. So how do you make a distinction between the sort of and I don't have the language that I'm looking for, but it seems like there's a legitimate place for let's say a healthy parent to tell a child, "Yeah, I know that you want to do that, but that can be destructive to you." So when your head's telling you, your heart's telling you, this is really, really, really what you want to do, I want to tell you, my one I love, that could destroy you. Where's the distinction between that sort of exercise of love and the sort of destructive outsourcing of moral authority that you described there?
Yeah, there's a few really significant key differences. One, when you are in this hypothetical, this thought experiment, say as a parent saying to a child, "I know you love this." What you're not saying is, "and what you love is bad." Right? You're also saying, "and here I'm going to tell you something about the consequences of that thing and pursuing that thing that are going to create outcomes that aren't healthy for you." So you're educating, you're empowering, you're educating, you're affirming the value of that place inside that wants and knows. Whereas in these authoritarian power structures where people are asking for people to hand them their moral reasoning, their sense of intuition, their spirituality, their compass, what people are usually saying is, what's inside of you is bad and never trust it. And I'm going to tell you the way always, and don't ask questions. Do what I say.
Yeah.
And here's the reason.
Yeah.
Like, you're going to suffer forever. So there's usually profound consequences that are also implicated in not obeying a leader. It's one of the ways that people can keep other people under control, is you create a really, really scary thing that happens if they don't agree with you. And a good example of that would be hell, right? I'm going to tell you that you and everyone you love will suffer forever, permanently, in a way that is disconnected from all connection and all goodness and all love if you don't do what I say, which is really different than a parent saying to a kid, like, "You're going to I know you want to eat all your Halloween candy. I'm actually going to, like, it's really hard to stop when you like it. And I know you're going to have a stomach ache. And like, okay, like, I know you want to eat an extra piece, but here, I'm going to tell you you're going to get a stomach ache. And you did. Oh, yeah, we talked about this, right? Yeah. Okay, let's remember that next time. And candy and wanting candy isn't bad. Eating so much of it that you get sick doesn't feel good for you versus, and if you eat your Halloween candy, you will suffer forever.
Yeah.
And so do what I say.
Right. You will go to hell for eating that candy.
You will go to hell.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like hell is a really interesting thing to bring into the conversation because it's used as the ultimate coercive tool. It's used as the strategy to create compliance amongst people because you create the most awful construct of what anyone could ever encounter and you say, do what I tell or this happens, it's going to be pretty motivating for people who don't want that thing to happen, especially if they've also been told that the leader would never lie to you and hell is real and right, all of the things.
Right. Well, and the ways in which that construct of hell can then be hung on so many things and the way it can become so dominating. I mean, I'm embarrassed to tell this story, but I think it speaks to the way in which the mechanism of hell operated in such a weighty fashion on me as a boy. Because, and you know, I don't think I've ever told this story on the show, so there's some listeners who are going to just roll their eyes, but you know, it was my experience. I remember one time when I was probably 16 and I was late for curfew, and I was driving down Alabama Country Road, and the speed limit was 55, and I looked down and I was going 57. And because I was, you know, running late, or maybe I was going 60, I don't know, it was, you know, 5 miles per hour, whatever it was speed limit.
Yeah.
And the first thought that went through my mind was, Lee, you better slow down, because if you had a wreck and got killed, 5 miles an hour is not worth an eternity in hell. And of course, at this point, I look back and that is insane. But it says a lot, I think, about the way in which this whole system of rightness and self-righteousness and sort of moral striving and the way hell was always hung over it all weighed so heavily upon me. And so, and another story that I'm just reminded of as you're talking about that, I remember when I was doing my PhD in theology, one day in a seminar class, I think we were talking about Augustine, I think, and the professor asked, there were about 8 or 10 of us in the room, and the professor asked, how many of you growing up lived in some sort of lived fear of hell? And only 2 or 3 of us raised our hand. I was one of them. Only 2 or 3 of us raised our hand. And I was really taken, I thought, what? There's only 2 or 3 of us? What's wrong with you people? But yeah, I think that certainly much of my experience has been kind of, among other things, working through the way in which that sort of fear was so dominant in my childhood experience.
Yes. And wait, that, I didn't add it to my previous list, but the fear of death, right? Death anxiety, as it's shaped by, I think, the construct of hell, is another thing that lives right under the radar for the average person in North America, whether they claim to have a religious identity in the present. The construct of hell and the fear of it can persist for people long after they deconstruct, if they were exposed to that idea as a child, because it is such a scary thing to be separated from everyone you love for eternity and to suffer perpetually. Yeah. So this is another marker of spiritual trauma, is fear of hell or death anxiety, which, you know, overlap very well.
Yeah. So all this goes back to the reason that I wanted to put scare quotes around the word God in that quote a moment ago, because I think that in my experience, I spent years of my life studying theology, and I know that there's some really beautiful, life-giving, joyous, glorious works of theology, and there's a lot of awful theology that creates deep anxiety, all sorts of turmoil, and is death-dealing. And so I'm always very cautious when someone wants to use the word God, or they'll say things like, God's will is or God says. And I always think, well, hang on just a second, right? Because there is no way anyone is going to say that unless it's being mediated through their own subjective interpretation and their own subjective experience. So I don't want somebody speaking for God that way. But I don't know, thoughts on that, reaction to that?
I think it's essential that we are always reminding ourselves that there is a hermeneutic between God and the story we tell about God that is largely shaped by our own lived experience and embodied reality.
Yeah.
I think someone was telling me recently, you might know about this too, about John Calvin having profound anxiety. Profound anxiety,
No, I did not know that.
developing so many of his theological arguments in response to managing his anxiety, which would make sense, right? If we're feeling wildly out of control, what might we do to try to manage that if no one's ever given us a strategy to be with where the fear is coming from?
Right.
We're going to try to do whatever we can to control or clamp down on that.
Yeah.
And if we can do that intellectually in a way that takes us out of how scary it feels in our body, like, I'm not saying it's a good idea, but as a psychologist, I totally get it. Like, coming up with the kinds of rigid theologies that he created is not that different than the person who has a profound anxiety and then tries to do everything right or has compulsions of certain sorts. But the point is that so much of what we think about God is a reflection of our embodied reality. And anytime we forget that we are bodies that shape our interpretations, then we forget that there is so much more of what is happening inside of us projected onto our ideas than there is the reality of the thing that happened.
Yeah.
It's like, it's pretty easy to get into social constructivism here and to talk about, like, maybe there isn't an essence of an experience or of a phenomena itself, because there's so, like, everything is layered with so much of our projection and interpretation.
Yeah. Well, this is one paragraph that I particularly drew out here. It begins, where I start to wince, this is you speaking, where I start to wince is when faith communities ascribe to God our own defense mechanisms. And then you go on and give a number of examples. But the last one in the paragraph is, we stoke in people an inner critic and tell them it's the voice of God, which I think is just a brilliant insight, right? Is that we can, as a community, we can cultivate these sort of inner reactions of anxiety or whatever the case may be, and then say, well, that's God, and it maybe have nothing to do with God. It may be the sorts of compulsions or the obsessions of a community that are death dealing. So I found that super helpful. But any further commentary on that?
Oh, just that it's so powerful to be able to pull those apart and realize that there is a voice inside that we have been handed by our community about how we should talk to ourselves. Maybe it's the critic, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's shame, maybe it's fear and anxiety. And we've been told it's God's voice or the Holy Spirit. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had people come through my office saying, I'm chronically anxious, but it's just me being convicted by the Spirit about all the bad that I've done in the world. And so this anxiety is good, and it's from God to try to keep me in alignment with the way that I should live. And my thinking is, no, you have an anxiety disorder, and your faith community really let you down and told you it was good that you were suffering. So now not only do you have the anxiety disorder, but you're probably going to have a hard time getting treatment for something that you actually want to be there, because it keeps in place this idea that you're bad and that this is helping you not be so bad.
Yeah. Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. Do you ever wish you had more folks to discuss the conversations we offer on No Small Endeavor? Something like a podcast listening club where you could engage big ideas about what it means to live life well and then discuss it with friends and companions? If so, you have stumbled upon the announcement you have been waiting for. We're pleased to announce the start of Endeavor Together, our new initiative that equips and nurtures close-knit communities to talk about the things you actually want to talk about.
Each small group conversation series is built upon our podcast content and provides you with super easy to use content with questions, videos, links, and guidance so that you or any good and willing soul can host small group conversations exploring what it means to live a good life. Maybe you'll meet in homes around a table, maybe in a coffee shop or local park, maybe at work during lunch hour, maybe in a church Sunday school class. What we are providing is the scaffolding for good conversation. The rest is up to you. And here's the best part. Thanks to generous support from the Lilly Endowment, it's free. The first 2 series have been released. The first, Let's Disagree Better, and the second, Vulnerability. Get started today. Visit nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Enjoy. You describe spirituality as our innate longing for connection. So how do you see trauma as cutting us off from that?
Yeah, I think that trauma inherently fragments. It pulls apart, it injures, right? It separates the things that are intrinsically designed to be connected. Mind and body, me and you, us and the earth, a sense of our interconnectedness as a species or with all living things. Trauma, it makes it really, really hard to be connected because our system gets so overwhelmed that ability to feel safe in the world and like we belong is usually one of the first things that goes, except if we have people step in and intervene in a way that takes on the role of connecting to us on our behalf. But trauma is, it just fragments apart these connections. Again, mind and body, me and you, and it can be a really powerful thing to begin to connect into mind and body, me and you on the other side of trauma recovery or trauma mending, because I think it begins to restore our felt sense of connectedness that gets robbed from us in the experiences that have us feel very unsafe and alone.
Mm-hmm. So what you began to kind of allude to this early in the conversation, but what in your mind means that some given experience is trauma for one and not trauma for another? Or to put it otherwise, I don't remember who this was, somebody in the positive psychology field I was reading a few years ago, but they were making the case that what for some leads to PTSD, for other leads to what they were calling post-traumatic growth. And that, as I understood their argument, that there are within a person the possibility of certain skills or other kind of markers of mental health that make it possible for them to navigate something very difficult, a real crisis, but something that's difficult, but it doesn't have to lead necessarily to post-traumatic stress disorder. What's your take on that?
Yes. Well, what the research literature says about that is a few things. One is pre, peri, and post-traumatic factors. So pre-traumatic factors are, how old are you? What's your gender? What life experience do you have? You can imagine a kid who goes through a parental divorce situation and they're 3 years old and their entire world feels like it's getting ripped apart. They don't have the same kind of internalized resources as maybe a 35-year-old whose parents are getting divorced. And you go, okay, this is really hard, but I know where to turn and I know the truth about who I am. And I have all of these embedded memories of feeling loved. Like that's a very simple and maybe common example for that we can extrapolate to other kinds of trauma. Like how old are you? What internalized resources do you have? And if you're younger or of a certain sex or gender, or if you are within a certain visible minority, if you like, what life experiences have you had that tell you that you're loved and safe and that you'll be held in the midst of really hard things? Peri-traumatic factors are, how long did it last? Was it an accident, an earthquake, or was it inflicted by a person or people? And who are those people? Are those people who should have taken care of you? Or are those random strangers? So those are peri-traumatic factors. And very specifically, did you dissociate during the experience? Was it so overwhelming that you actually left awareness of your body as a means of surviving? Third factor is post-traumatic factors, which I think is really salient in this conversation, because one of the most significant predictors of if a trauma becomes a trauma in terms of how it lives in the body is how does the community or how does your relational web respond to the thing that happened to you? Do you have places you can go and be believed? Or is everyone saying, oh, it's good that it happened. This is God teaching you how to grow. There's a lesson here to join in Christ's suffering, right? Or whatever the story is. So do you have a family doctor who you can tell about what happened if it was a single incident event? Do you have people who say, I believe you, I want to know, I want to walk through this with you. That must have been so hard. Tell me more about it. Or are you left to be all alone because you know people are just going to say, well, you wanted it, didn't you? So we have the pre, peri, and post-traumatic factors. And what we know is that if people have better resources ahead of time, if the trauma is more accidental, there's no dissociation, right? It's not active or long-lasting. It wasn't happening at the hands of people who hurt you. And if after people came to your rescue effectively to support you, you have a better chance of doing some more meaning-making, of growing, of getting some insight from it, of struggling and suffering, but suffering through. And what we often say with trauma is not suffering. Trauma is the inability to suffer. It is so big that it overwhelms our ability to suffer. And why spiritual trauma is so distinct from other kinds of single incident trauma is it's usually complex, which means that trauma is not happening one event. It's not a car accident with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It is a lifetime. It's a community. It's a series of events that happen even projected into the future, into eternity. It is constant. It's being reinforced at so many different angles and in so many ways. So people are more likely to have post-traumatic growth if it's a single incident, but most spiritual trauma is not a single incident. It's a lifetime of traumas, which we would call complex trauma, which begins to shape personality. It begins to become the fabric of how a person lives in the world, as opposed to, a fully organized, developed, secure sense of self, a bad thing, and then recovery on the other side.
I know for me as well, in processing some of my childhood stuff that I didn't know how to process well as I got older from my childhood church experiences. For a long time, I've been able to look back and realize that once I got exposure to more sane, rational, theological teaching in college and then in seminary, I was able very quickly to discard a lot of that from my childhood intellectually. But what was remarkable to me is that then I realized even in my early mid-40s, I was still processing that stuff emotionally. And in some ways, even still process it emotionally even more recently. And that there's something about the way it gets in us that it just has such a long tail, even though I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist or brain scientist, but the way I think about it, even though my prefrontal cortex can say that stuff's irrational, you don't have to worry about that stuff. There's something about, there's some part of me in which there's still this anxiety or this deep sadness or grief that I need to do about a lot of that kind of stuff. But I don't know, commentary on that?
Of course. Well, there's actually I would say an emerging finding, probably within the last 5 years, within the religious de-identification research literature, particularly a scholar named Darrell Tongren, who's really leading a lot of this work with his team and colleagues. And it's called the religious residue hypothesis. So my colleague who I'd mentioned earlier, Dr. Preston Hill, says religion is sticky. Right? When we have these deeply embedded beliefs that we are reinforcing, that have big consequences to us disagreeing with or doing anything different with, there's a fear component and there's a social belonging component. When those things happen at a really early age, they get baked in so deep that they actually shape the structure of our brain. They shape the structure of our personality, our anatomical, like I said, our anatomical structures. That's really how development of our brain and neural workings happens, is through developmental experiences, and then experiences over time. We actually see the function and the structure of our brain take place. So what we know with religious residue hypothesis is that people are disagreeing with theological beliefs, but are still carrying the felt and behavioral imprint of those beliefs. And a good example of that would be a person who says, I don't believe in the devil, but man, at night I'm scared of hell. I am scared of hell. Or people who bow to pray before a meal, and they're like, who am I praying to? Right? But maybe there's even that sense of, it feels right. It feels right to bow my head and pause for a moment, but what the heck am I doing? And who is like where, and who is this idea and these words going to? Or maybe people who say, like, I don't believe that purity culture and high control of sexuality is good or right, but I feel really guilty when I masturbate or when I have a sexual experience with a new partner, and I'm not in church or I'm not in purity culture, but people will have panic attacks, will have fear, will have intrusive thoughts related to sexual experiences that linger from a purity culture context that they don't agree with anymore. And so that's religious residue, that our brain-body system is telling the story of who we've been and where we've come from. And as much as we'd like to admit, or as much as we maybe have a hard time admitting, those places inside of us are still within us. And for people who are doing this work of deconstructing and de-identifying and sorting through religious trauma, it is a very difficult thing to live with. The imprint of these past experiences that hurt us still that are really here in our brain-body system to this day. Maybe even people who say, I love my gay and my queer community. I still have this weird internalized homophobia, and it's so bizarre, and I want to get rid of it, and I hate it. I hate this inside of myself, but it's still here. And it's the truth of what it's like to grow up in any context, whether it's family or cultural or religious, that where we come from has shaped us in some way. And we have to learn to be in relationship with those parts of us so that we don't try to reject ourselves in a way that reenacts the exclusionary beliefs and practices of the communities we came from.
Yeah. You've written some about your own experience and some of a childhood experience, or not, as I recollect, not a personal abuse experience in your home church, but a pastoral leader who was abusive in your home church context. And then the way some perfectionisms also came up in you, and the way some of the negative impacts that had upon you. But to whatever degree you would like to share, how does some of your own personal experience inform the work that you were doing?
Yeah. I don't know if there's any work that I do with heart and meaning that doesn't connect to me in some way.
Yeah.
We always say in the academic world, research is me search.
Yeah.
And so on some level, we're all trying to work our stuff out. Yeah. And I really care deeply about spiritual trauma. And I cared deeply at first because my patients were telling me that this was painful for them and unresolved, and there weren't resources. And it wasn't actually until I started to do the research for the podcast and then for the book that I thought, oh my gosh, there's way more here than I even knew. And so I think it's kind of funny and backwards for me, my story of, it's like the insight that I had about caring came before the insight that I had about it being personally meaningful. Like I could kind of tell you in this abstracted way. But let me tell you, I had a book. The podcast was due to the producer, the material that I was creating, probably 7 months before I actually got it done, because I got so deep into my own processing of this that I couldn't work on it. And the truth is, like, most of the things that are difficult for me or that I'm still actively working through aren't in the book, because that doesn't feel fair to my process. So I wrote about things that feel like, oh, I can talk about those from a healthy distance now. But the truth is, I think I'll be negotiating and excavating probably for the rest of my life, which I am now at peace with, like the time that it takes to unravel and to develop. And I'm more concerned with learning to be in relationship with the parts of me that still feel stuck in that old way of thinking or being than I am about trying to rid myself of them.
Yeah.
But even just the other day, I mean, there's something actively happening in my life, which I won't share more details about, but has been excruciatingly painful for me. And the thought that has come up as this painful thing has been going on and on and on and on is, wait, did I do something to cause this? And I remember saying that I've said that to friends, I've said that to my husband, I've talked about it in therapy, and people have said back to me, like, of course you didn't, but can you see how your propensity to ask yourself if you caused it is a leftover of the spiritual trauma of the context that said if bad things happen, it's because you sinned. Now, I don't have that language for myself anymore, but it's like the seeds of that are there. Because so many of us are handed these very like thin views of suffering that give us from a very early age the framework. If something bad happens, you're either being taught a lesson or you've done something bad.
Yeah.
And so I can feel that even now, recognizing I have to walk myself back from it and just say, no, sometimes painful things that are out of your control are just painful because they're painful.
Yeah.
And we try so hard to make meaning to get away from how painful it is.
Right.
And yet what we really need to do is just feel the pain of it.
Yeah. So let's shift and talk a little bit about the body and somatic experience. We interviewed Peter Levine a year or two ago, and I was fascinated with this research study that he shared, where he was talking about, I forget all the specifics, but it was some sort of research study done with mice, and that they were exposed to the scent of cherry blossoms, I think it was.
Oh, yes.
And then when they exposed them to that scent, they shocked them such that they grew anxious and defecated. And then they bred the mice, and they found out that 6 generations later, you could still expose those great-great-great-grandchildren or whatever of the original generation to the scent of cherry blossoms, and they would grow anxious and defecate on themselves. And I just found this so fascinating because I think that there's a sort of, it seems to me that we know so little about this, at least on a more popular level, that there's still in me a part that's like, really? Do we really carry trauma in our body? And I think that sort of research certainly got my attention. But I don't know, tell us more about the way you're seeing this and what the research is telling us and teaching us and what you've learned about that.
Yeah. Well, this is a really well-known study for people who are interested in reading about it. So Diaz and Resler are the authors. It's a 2014 publication, and it's been essential for us to understand epigenetics, epigenetic trauma, the way that memory is passed down through bodies in unconscious ways, even without language, even without storytelling. And I think what it does is it allows us to see that there is something of our body, one, that is telling a story. And that's kind of a new idea if we have been taught that our body is just an object to manage or control, to see, oh, our body is telling a story. And 2, our body might be telling a story about society, about relationships, about ancestry, about survival, that there is something of bodies that actually is essential for our felt sense of connection to each other and the way that we survive in community. So that study, I love coming back to it over and over because it, again, speaks to the intelligence of bodies. And what does that actually look like? Well, we can speculate because, again, this was a study with rodents and not with people. Although Rachel Yehuda is a scholar who's looked at intergenerational trauma and epigenetic trauma with Holocaust survivors and their descendants to have similar phenomena when descendants of Holocaust survivors smell certain smells, that they have distress reactions that descendants of non-Holocaust survivors don't have, which, again, signals something about the olfactory pathway, how smell is really essential for us in terms of survival, but how we pass memory even without words. But what this speculatively looks like for us is perhaps our sense of activation in a certain moment maybe being meaningful in a way that extends beyond our lifetime. Maybe it's something that our body is telling us about how people in our past learned to survive or what was scary for them. It may be that for some people walking down the street, they all of a sudden start to panic and they have no clue why. And instead of saying, what's wrong with me? My body is out of control. What if we were able to say, I wonder if my body is telling the memory for me, or is reminding me that something happening in my environment that I'm sensing or experiencing in some way was scary in the past. And instead of shaming myself or blaming myself or disavowing the body or subduing the body, what if I was able to say, oh, hey, body, you're safe now. Like that was a long time ago and we're safe. Because there is such a thing in terms of epigenetics of switching genes off. There is such a thing as us being able to say we can course correct as a species, which maybe, I mean, I don't know about mice consciousness, but maybe not something that mice are able to do. Like maybe they lick each other to calm each other down or things like that. But there's a possibility for us to say, okay, body, like here we are, we're safe, whatever this is from, we got through. And that could be because of cues that we have nothing to do with, like no awareness of. All of a sudden we're panicking and we don't know why. Or things like we walk by a church, we see some really activating language, our body gets all stirred up, and we get to say to ourselves, hey, you made it out. And nobody's going to make you believe that. And you're safe now.
Yeah. You, early in your book, you kind of expand a vision for thinking about spiritual trauma beyond just church abuse, including things like colonization or racialized violence justified by religion. But I don't know, any other kind of comments about the way our learning about trauma can help us pay attention to these larger systemic realities in ways that we ought to be paying attention to them?
It's kind of my favorite thing to talk about related to this right now, because it feels like it's pushing us. I'm ready for us to push ourselves to a new edge with the conversation of spiritual trauma. When people will say to me, "What? Oh gosh, everyone is talking about spiritual trauma these days. Like, or where is this coming from? Or how come all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there are so many people talking about this?" And it's a very Eurocentric, white-centric way of looking at spiritual trauma, because Indigenous populations have been talking about spiritual trauma since first contact on Turtle Island. The fact that we call this North America and not Turtle Island and the fact that there's colonization and that we are not under Indigenous governance and rule, and that the church is involved in that through the doctrine of discovery. I mean, all of these are imprints of or legacy of spiritual trauma. So I think it's important to recognize that this has been going on a long time, and it may just be that Westernized and white contexts are new to the conversation that has been happening for a long time. And we can learn something of sustainable ways of living. We can learn something about repair and reconciliation on a large scale when we remind ourselves this problem has been going on a long time, and there are people who've been working on resolving and mending and sorting for much longer than we have been in this conversation. And it's a really important thing to see that our perspective of spiritual trauma also needs to extend beyond how have I individually been hurt to how have I been a part of hurting others. And that conversation can be very overwhelming if we have a deeply held core belief that we are bad and broken. Because it's easy for us to move into a shame spiral or into collapse or into like the frozenness of, well, I can't do anything and I'm just bad and I can't, right? Or moving really quick into trying to solve the problem on our own. Like there's a gentleman in the book whose work I include significantly because it's so important on this topic, Mark Charles. He's one of the co-authors of the book Unsettling Truths, which is looking at the origin of the doctrine of discovery and how it's shaped what we understand as America and North America to this day. But what's really interesting about the stories he tells, if you listen to his work and engage with his work, is he'll say he'll go do this talk. He's an Indigenous man and a pastor. He'll go talk about reconciliation and the doctrine of discovery and lament, like what do we need to do to repair? And he'll say there'll often be a single person who comes up after and says, like, I'm so sorry, and looks grief-stricken, and I'm bad, and will, try to wash his feet and try to make it right. And he will regularly remind people to think that you can solve a systemic problem individually is an artifact of spiritual trauma. To think that you can do it on your own, that there's even such a thing as an individual, means the roots of how deep this goes are way beyond what we can even conceptualize at this point. We can't solve systemic problems individually in totality. But what we can do is say, how can I be a part of looking at this? How can I be a part of change? How can I be a part of seeing how deep this goes in me and in these systems, and doing the little bits that I can over time to shift things in a different direction? And it is very hard to have the capacity to do that if we believe that we're deeply bad.
Yeah.
So I remind people regularly, some of the best work that you can do in service of changing systems is actually begin to turn towards the places of hate inside, the judgment inside, the trauma inside, and learn to love those places or let them be loved. And it's when we do that and we can begin to trust that we are secure, that we are lovable, that we can be good people who have done bad or harmful things, then we're less threatened when we start to look towards our role in harming others.
That's just remarkable. This week, I was talking to a friend who has experienced some serious abuse, serious transgressive experiences that she had as a child. And she'd done a lot of work around that, and then I was sharing some of my own experience with therapy and so forth, and the work I've had to do. And then she said, "Do you ever feel like doing this kind of work is indulgent?" And that particular word indulgent struck me because I have another friend who has asked me that very same question, using the language of, "Do you feel like doing therapy is self-indulgent?" And I gave her my answer, but I would wonder how would you respond to somebody who asked that question?
A couple different options. One, I'm probably going to respond differently if it's a patient and I know their history and I know what's going on. But when I hear you say that, my first thought is, in family systems where childhood abuse happened and wasn't known about and supported, or people tried to talk about it and weren't believed or protected, it's not unusual for there to be a belief that goes along with that says it's indulgent to make room for my own experience. And it may be that belief is an artifact of the family or the abuse, as opposed to a reflection of the therapeutic process. So it may be for people who were never given room to look at what's inside of them and feel and actually have the attention of an adult on their most vulnerable places. They might have no way to make meaning of it. And the only strategy is to say, like, this is too much. Like, I shouldn't have this. I'm not entitled to this kind of care because I never had it before. But another way of looking at it is, I think some therapy, when it doesn't return us to our communities and doesn't empower us to move, at least eventually or in some way, into connection with others, can keep us oriented towards ourselves. I don't think that there's ever any healing that happens individually or just for the good of the person. I think that when healing happens, it changes, like naturally, very naturally, the way that we relate to others in the world. And if we can see that the way that we are with ourselves changes the way that we are with others, maybe it seems like a slow trickle-out effect, but there is something good that happens in the world when we learn to be more kind and loving, even if it starts with what's inside of us. And if our therapy isn't helping us show up in the world in a way that brings us into relationship or feels a sense of meaning or purpose or connection, even later down the line, like I work with really complex trauma and really complex cases where I will tell you, if someone comes in, I'm not saying, and how are you going to heal the world with the work that we did? Like that is like not a question that I am bringing up early on, but even the developer or the kind of the first person to initiate a definition of complex trauma, Dr. Judith Herman, who's a psychiatrist and is a pioneer in the field of trauma studies, had said that one of the final phases of recovery from trauma and complex trauma is, okay, what do we do with all of this now? And I think sometimes what we do with it is, oh gosh, I'm just going to let my heart break for the people in my life who've suffered, and I'm not going to silence them. And sometimes it's more and different than that. But I do think that the natural process of healing takes us into connection with the world, which brings us very nicely back to that definition of spirituality, which has me think that therapy, when done well, healing, when done well, is a spiritual endeavor that brings us into connection.
And that relates to your, near the end, where you say that you see grief as a form of hope. So unpack that a little bit for us.
Mm-hmm. Grief is a way that we get to look back on what happened to us and what happened in general and feel the impact of it and feel the truth of the awfulness. And that is really the birthplace of so much new happening. To be able to get to the other side of something and to look back and feel for ourselves or for the world what was necessary at the time, but we didn't get. One, it signals that we are really witnessing and honoring the wound in a way that too, we can only do when we're through it enough. You can't grieve in the middle of something overwhelming. We're too disconnected from that source of pain. But grief allows us to recognize the full impact. And it's when we do that we're already enough on the other side and the birthplace of something new coming through.
So as we do move toward a close here, point us towards what you see as a kind of standard, if there is such a one, process of moving towards healing. What might that entail? If somebody is listening and they say, I think I have this sort of reality that I've not addressed in my own life, what kind of next steps, and then what might the process look like as they seek to address these things?
Yeah. I'm such a phenomenologist that I don't know if there's one specific way. I think each of us need to have our own way. And it's when we have been prescribed one way. I mean, hear the language. It's so on the nose. The way. Yeah. Here's the way, the truth, and the path to healing. As if I, alter the word slightly, like be leery of that. But what we can say is there are a few things that we know are helpful for people, like making space to be with the pain, learning some of the skills that were packed away when we had to suppress ourselves, like learning to say no, learning to feel our feelings, learning to have boundaries, learning to feel like, oh, I don't have to rescue everybody. I don't have to be codependent with every person on the planet. Otherwise, they suffer forever. Like, oh, I can actually care for myself and, to the best of my ability, the people around me. And grief is really important. Feeling connection to the body is really important. And usually meaning making and finding a new way of engaging with spirituality so that we can feel satisfied, fulfilled, held, connected as we begin to look back at the pain. But sometimes it's very important to go back right into the memories, into the scenes, into the feelings of what happened to us and the damage that it did. But we can only really do that when we have enough of a sense of stability and connection in relationship, community, and therapy to feel like that's not gonna totally overwhelm us.
Been talking to Hillary McBride, clinical psychologist, researcher, and author, discussing her book, Holy Hurt, Understanding Spiritual Trauma and the Process of Healing. Hillary, thanks so much for the wonderful conversation and for your beautiful work you're doing in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, for reading, and thank you everyone for listening. It feels so good to have been with you.
When the holidays start to feel a bit repetitive, reach for a Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry and put your twist on tradition. A bold cranberry and winter spice flavor fusion, Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry is a refreshing way to shake things up this sipping season. And only for a limited time. Sprite, obey your thirst.
We find Vecna, we end this once and for all, together.
On December 25th.
We have a plan. It's a bit insane. Everyone in?
He knows where we are.
Watch out! Get ready for one last adventure.
We stay true to ourselves. Stay true to our friends, no matter the cost.
Found you. Stranger Things, Season 5, Volume 2, begins December 25th, only on Netflix.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.